Hello, everybody, and welcome to the permissions panel for DAOcember. Today, we've got three of us. I guess I'm in the moderator role, so I'll be kind of introducing a few different questions and topics, and trying to take a little bit of a step back. But I may be nerd sniped every once in a while into participating in the discussion myself. But with me, I've got Luuk from various places, including Kolectivo and Prime, and I have Carlos here from Aragon. Those are woefully inadequate introductions, though. So the first thing I want to do is just have each of you say a little bit about who you are, your background, what you're working on today, and however else you would like to introduce yourself. So Luuk, let's start with you.
Epic. Thank you so much, Spencer. Looking forward to nerd sniping you. I'm Luuk, born and raised in the Caribbean. Been involved in DAOs now for a little bit over 4 years. The journey started back in 2018 in Genesis Alpha from DAOstack. That kicked off my first kind of real-world DAO experimentation. We did a research in the potential of DAO governance for small island development states. And that started the whole journey from starting CuraDAO, a social impact DAO in 2019, to being at the forefront of different DAOs being initiated, including Prime DAO. The DAOist, that was also one of the early team members there. And then more recently, we're now starting Kolectivo, which is trying to build a toolkit for real-world impact economies using Web3. Maybe a little bit about my relationship to this panel. We developed under the Prime DAO project about a year ago a set of contracts, which we call Badger. That term, kind of badges, have been adopted quite a lot since. And since we've been building kind of these control services and permission services for DAOs, both to be used in all of these projects, actually. I'm excited to be here today.
All right, Carlos.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's pretty exciting. I think, Luuk, we met a couple months ago in Berlin, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, very happy to be here. A little bit about myself. I started to get into crypto around 2016, mainly as a developer. I was doing some smart contracts, and then I started my own project on top of Augur, which was called Gesser. We got acquired by Gemini some time ago, doing DeFi stuff there, staking, all the stuff. And then around 6 months ago, I joined Aragon, where I'm the CTO. And right now, we're mostly working on releasing like the new version of our project. And I guess the relation with permissions is one of like the new ways that we have in our protocol to create granular permissions for DAOs to execute different kind of things with more granularity. And we can get into it later, but I will leave it there.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for joining us. I would like to start the permissions panel with what might seem like a very simple question, but I'm hoping that there is some really interesting stuff a little bit deeper in response. Not to put you guys under too much pressure, but I want to ask, what are permissions?
I guess I can go first. Permission, I mean, it's a very broad word. I guess you are asking mostly regarding DAOs, or like, yeah, or even smart contract in general, doesn't have to be DAO. I would say, from my perspective, it's mostly about giving the access to execute things, or at least in the more technical level, is giving access to execute things to an address or set of addresses that can represent a person, agent, DAO, or whatever. Those executions can be anything really. You can have permissions to withdraw, permissions to execute, permissions to, literally anything. But basically granting the allowance to have an action over something. That's like the most general thing that you can say, but it's a very broad question.
It's a super broad question indeed. I think it's really about giving this right to do a particular thing. And I think in a sense of where I think permission is really relevant is not just allowing anybody to do anything, but allowing specific groups or specific people with the right ability and context to do a specific thing. think that's what kind of excites me.
But what about permissions is different now? So the concept of permissions has existed, I'm sure, for, well, at least conceptually, theoretically, for for a very long time in technology, for quite a long time in the history of technology as well. What is different about permissions now? And feel free to define now however you'd like, but probably it's something to do with smart contracts or DAOs or blockchains or whatever this thing is that we are sort of calling Web3 in general. What's different now about permissions?
All of the things you mentioned, DAOs, smart contracts, blockchains, but I think especially this ability to have code that you know 100% sure what it will be able to do, and having the transparency to view that code, I think is groundbreaking. Previously, you would be able to have permissions, but you were never certain that only those with those permissions were able to do a certain action. If you look at kind of traditional systems, look at what SBF did with FTX. There were permissions that should not have been there that were there. And I think now that we have these open smart contracts, we're able to validate the functions of a specific contract, and there's no way around it. I think that really sets a new tone for permissions. And because you're able to do that in a scalable and codable way, you're able to open up permissions as well to new set of stakeholders that you traditionally wouldn't be able to give those rights in a Web2 world.
Yeah, also something that I think is very valuable is one of the biggest solutions that crypto did, which is basically tokens. It's super simple, like it isn't much by itself, but it allows to have permissions that are more easygoing in the sense like in the previous Web2, normally you always thought about permissions about giving a particular account the access or the rights over something, but never was something as fluid as what we have nowadays with tokens. And you can have, for example, permissions to any token holder to create a proposal, for example. That's one permission. And it's so fluid that it allows for moving every block. And that's something that we couldn't do before. It's something that till now, if you wanted to vote for a government, you had to go over several days process to get a visa or whatever you need to get for voting in that country. And that's one of the biggest evolutions in that sense. Right now, everyone can participate in that without having to do much. Get a token that you can get airdrop and you're good to go.
Would you categorize your responses as Web3 technologies enhance what permissions can do or make them more efficient or sort of in some way improve them? Or is there also, and maybe not, but is there also some way that permissions are fundamentally changed, or the concept of what a permission is truly different, like at a real fundamental level?
So coming back to like the tokens, I think the revolution here for them is that permissions became permissionless. It's kind of weird, but it's actually true in the sense like before with Web2, you always had to have an account that was enabling the permissions over another account. And with a smart contract, you can automate that in a more fluid way, and you can have things that you couldn't do before because like there was no ownership over anything in Web2. And that's one of the biggest revolutions that we have within crypto, that you finally have ownership over something, and that gives you rights over any other, like over some actions. So this is something that couldn't be done before. You couldn't have this ownership or like this tokens before in a permissionless manner. Now you can automate these processes. And yeah, that's one of the things that you couldn't do before, but now you can actually do. And it actually reflects what's going on in crypto. Like almost everything is become a DAO. Like now you don't want to create a DAO, you want to create a DAO. And the reason is because it's finally doable and it couldn't be done before.
Let's go from there a little bit. Why should anybody care about that? We can do these new things. What does that in turn enable? Or what's what's good about that or better?
I think it unleashes a whole set of new ways to coordinate, where traditionally information flowed and kind of control flowed in a top-down manner. That was the primarily way to organize and get big things done. And now we're seeing more like network organizations and groups of people that structure completely differently, because you're now able to, because of the internet and Web3, you're now able to structure information and resources in a completely new way that allows, for example, an organization like Gitcoin to operate the way it does without needing, we're just giving a whole new dimension of how that coordination happens and who the stakeholders are and how they relate to this entity or this DAO. I think that the magic around that is that there's a lot of problems that we traditionally haven't been able to solve because of the limitations in human coordination. I mean, Moloch is a big meme, but it's a very serious meme. We humans could potentially out coordinate nearly all human problems, but we're still struggling to find the right way to do that. And I think that by reimagining ownership, by reimagining permission, we are able to unlock really new dimensions of coordination.
Yeah, totally support that. Also, something that I think is really powerful is that we are finally being able to experiment with governance at the speed of software, in the sense like we are able to have very fluid laws that evolve over the time with different set of properties. And it's funny that when you ask someone, how do you want your DAO to be? Every single person has different opinions. And that's great. That's great because it allows to innovate in something that till now it's been very slow and it's been really hard to experiment with. And that's what it leads. It leads these new permissions that we are setting. And it's something that you can see in crypto, like everyone is doing their DAO in a different way and in a way that it suits them. And it's something that couldn't be done before.
How does that work with permissions? If we think about the word permissions, somebody is permitting somebody else to do something. How can that be a bottom-up experience or a bottom-up? How can that lend itself to anything bottom-up?
So I would say network, not per definition bottom-up. Kind of not seeing it even as a pyramid where it's either top-down or bottom-up, but really seeing it as an evolving network of different relationships. And it's those relationships that matter. In a network, there's different points of centrality, there's different structures, but they're all reinforcing each other. So to give an example, imagine we, all the 22 people in this group, we control a treasury together that gets to decide who gets to drive the car tomorrow. Now, if we all control that decision together, then we're able to make those decisions in a completely different fashion, right? It's not top down. It's not you, Spencer, deciding who drives the car tomorrow. It's us all deciding who to drive the car tomorrow. But now let's imagine after a week of that going on, we don't want to all vote on who gets to drive the car. So we elect a group out of those 22 people here to maybe a group of 3 people to make that decision from now on. Now, if those 3 people don't do that properly, we as a group are able to revoke those rights again or those permissions again. And through using this kind of permission frame, we're able to now kind of like Carlos mentioned, innovate much quicker with how we want to coordinate our organization or our network. So again, by allowing these relationships to be structured through permissions, we're able to innovate quite rapidly on how we want the organization or governance to be designed.
One of the things that I actually always like to think about like having guilds, which is related to this, is like they are basically just permissions over some funds. And you can have super flat structures. That's fine if your DAO works fine with that. For other DAOs that you need, like that you want to work on guilds or pods, having this permission management, it's actually a more fluid way to interact with DAO normally. or to organize your organization. So you don't really have to create another sub-DAO that is a full-fledged operating system over some treasury. You just need to have permissions over the main DAO flow that allows to have like several guilds making decisions over some treasury with some constraints that you can set in the permissions. So you can have, for example, a guardian or oracle in your permission in a way that allows your guild, for example, to have permission to withdraw some funds on only to these two addresses and maximum of 3 Ether, for example. So these permissions are allowing to different agents to execute stuff on the DAO, while at the same time having like the check on balances every single time, and like having some boundaries over what they can do in a trustless manner. That way you can operate super fast without having to be asking every single time if you want to do X or Y, and still have the transparency of what crypto enabled over Web2. So transparency is something that is super valuable, and permissions are something that allow for that to still to happen. Otherwise, you would send the fund over a one account, and that one account will hold everything and will do whatever. And permissions allow to decentralize that ownership over the fund.
We've been playing in a little bit of a theory land thus far. Let's get a little bit more concrete. What are some of your favorite or most interesting projects that you're aware of that are building in this space? And feel free to talk about your own or others, or a combination, or whatever you'd like.
Yeah, so one of my favorite kind of newer innovations are anything soulbound related or kind of permission NFT related. I think you guys with Hedge Protocol are doing an epic work. We had some early development going on with Prime DAO, where we built a system that we call Badger. That name has been ripped by now, but we launched it about a year ago, and it allowed us to mint ERC1155 NFTs that had also some access control rights using Zodiac from Safe. So what this allowed us to do is to create roles inside of a DAO with access control to specific parts. And that has been quite useful. I would say that it turned out for most use cases we have nowadays, we don't actually need yet that granular level of control, as most DAOs that we operate in are still rather small and have a kind of manageable group of contributors. But I think that as the stakes get higher and higher in the coming years, that tools like that kind of manage better access control are going to be more and more important. And you can see a lot of projects, I think Aragon as well, moving more and more towards this direction of more granular permission. And I think if you combine that with some form of identity or better navigation, similar to what, for example, Other Space is doing, I think you're adding a lot of value for people to understand and operate inside of DAOs. And I think that, again, thinking about coordination costs and how we coordinate, that if those processes on understanding DAOs and operating in them is better and more easy, that we will be able to drive coordination costs down and eventually beat the Web2 alternatives to how we organize in the current space.
I'll go like a little bit farther down the line. I will say one of the projects that thinks a lot about permissions in the opposite direction, and I actually really enjoy it because of that, is Ride. It's not like there is no governance, there are no permissions, it's work. So if you don't need permissions, if like everything's automated, that's the best solution that you can achieve. Permissions just try to fill those gaps where you cannot do that. I think as the space evolves, I agree with Luuk that more granular permissions are going to be needed, just so you can fill those gaps that are more narrow and not granted executions for literally everything. Because like for many DAOs, when you grant execution permissions, for example, you are giving grants to execute whatever you like into it. So basically, you can add any payload in the DAO and execute whatever and withdraw all the funds directly, or do something more obscure. Who knows? So granular permissions, as Luuk mentioned, is something that we are really working really hard on nailing down and ensuring that the experience is good, because that's also like very problematic. But it allows, for example, cool things over. You could have a sub build that can execute from the DAO, but only one specific function. So that guild, for example, can have access only to publish in mirror or via mirror over like from the DAO itself, which is super cool. They don't have access to the funds. They don't have access to anything. They just can call one function, which is going to be published via mirror. And those granular permissions, if you nail them down in the UI perspective, I think it's going to be a game changer for many.
Can you talk a little bit more about how that works? You're talking about the Aragon stuff, right?
Yeah. But like, I think Luuk is also working on some more granular permissions. In our case, when you develop your DAO or your plugin for our protocol, you can set the permissions to execute one function or the other. And when you set that permission, you also add one contract, which is what we call the Oracle permission. And that Oracle or Guardian, however you want to call it, can have a different set of rules, like more granular set of rules. So it's not just that you have access over executing one function, it's executing that function with under certain circumstances. So it will check what's the payload that you're executing. It will check what's the function, the 4-byte function we call it, the more technical level. It will check the parameters that you're sending to that function. It will check anything that you like there. And it can allow to like ensure that you are not passing boundaries of over execution. Because normally the problem is that execution is so broad that if you just grant permissions over execution, you are missing all the security, because like you are granting literally power over everything in the DAO.
Got it. Cool. How does that? I think a lot of within DAOhaus we make pretty heavy use of Zodiac, and so I think a lot of people here are probably familiar with Zodiac, which can do some of those things. But I'm curious, like would that would love to hear Carlos, your comparison of the approach that Aragon is taking to Zodiac. How can that comparison help us better understand some different approaches that are possible and what you guys are focused on?
So to be honest, I'm not that sure of how it works right now in Zodiac. Did you know if it's closer to, for example, the previous versions of Aragon, the ACL? I'm not sure if it has been updated or not. Sorry.
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think the main difference because is basically that when you set the permissions, you set also, so like the permission normally is like a role from an address to another address. That's normally what a permission is. One role, so that is like what are you going to execute from one address to the other. So what we added there, it's another fourth parameter, which is the Oracle permission. And I don't think that's in Zodiac right now. Well, yeah, I'm mostly sure that it isn't right there. That fourth parameter is a function of another contract or another contract that needs to be called, and we'll check the parameters that you're sending and ensure that the requirements are being set. And that's like the main difference, that there is this contract that is going to be called and it will check whatever the conditions are programmed in there. It can be empty though, like if you don't want any granular permissions, that's still fine. So no gas are spent for nothing.
Got it. So you're like embedding or creating the possibility of embedding any kind of logic that anybody could dream up inside of the permission itself.
Exactly. And it goes down to a singular permission. It's not over a general permission. It's mostly about the permission that your address has against my address. That has a particular oracle or a particular permission, granular permission. It's not just like an oracle that fits into a role. It's way more granular. It's about a relation, one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, cool. I think this gets at or starts to get at like some of the things that smart contracts open up with respect to permissions. Like we can make a permission like an object of its own and do lots of fun, cool, interesting, dynamic things with that object rather than just having that object be just having a permission be a relationship. It can also be it can be a rich relationship, which I think is super exciting. And there's probably lots of unexplored space there.
Maybe if I can ask you a question, Spencer.
Sure.
This is already the right moment. I know you guys in the DAOs community have been quite, let's call it resourceful with sub DAOs and minions and things like that. How have you experienced the permission relationship between, let's call them mother DAOs or main DAOs and minions, and kind of what are your main learnings from that?
This is both a hard question to answer and a really interesting one to think about. From the very beginning of when DAOhaus kind of became what people know DAOhaus as today, which is this is like almost a couple years ago now, which is when Uberhaus was first created and the house token was first created. We created this distinction or difference between Uberhaus, which was a DAO or still is DAO of DAOs, with the responsibility to manage and control the. That's basically where the house treasury was. I was going to say housed, but that was the home of the house treasury. And WarCamp, which is the DAO that is comprised of the primary core contributors to DAOhaus, the product, now the protocol, etc. WarCamp was sort of given the responsibility, the permission to manage like a treasury of mostly stable coins. I think, and then we've sort of further split up access or rights over or like permissions for spending those stable coins into smaller DAOs, and we kind of did that on a periodic basis. And those smaller DAOs and their minions were responsible for different aspects of building DAOhaus, writing code, doing community work, doing tokenomic stuff, etc. I think one of the things that we have kind of gone back and forth about is the granularity of like how much funding those or how much funding each of those subgroups should be have access to at any given point, or rather, or like really what was that question was, or in question was how often they needed to ask for additional, in the language of this panel, how often they needed to ask for additional permissions. I think that was an interesting spectrum that we played around with some different values on. I don't think we ever found the exact right answer, probably because the right answer was probably changing over time as other circumstances changed. I suspect that we would have done things differently if some of the tools for more granular permissions, like are starting to emerge, existed a couple of years ago or even a year ago. So I do suspect that the DAOhaus organism probably would look a little bit differently. And in fact, like a lot of some of the challenges that we faced in terms of giving more granular permissions to people and delegating responsibility and things like that inspired what I'm working on now with HATS protocol.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think this tension between ability and permission. Kind of you mentioned, when do we top up these groups again? In theory, they could continue doing the work that they're doing forever, but of course, they also need to be paid for it. I think this is an interesting tension that I'm seeing a lot in more recent, and I would say well-established, or at least good intended DAOs. Is in theory, everybody can participate and vote, but then there's still one or two big whales that still swing every single vote. So although everybody has permission to participate and permission to vote and permission to bring up any proposal, they don't really have the ability to make any real decisions in the end. And I think that's also a tension that, yeah, I think we're now slowly learning how to manage that better, which where we kind of suck, I would say, compared to traditional governance structures, where there are ways to avoid that one single person, even though they're super cool and special and rich, can make all the decisions. But yeah, that's something that I've seen happen a lot, and I'm kind of frustrated. I'm not frustrated, but I do think that we can do much better than that, and that a part of this permission is also understanding how we enable ability once someone has the permission to do something.
One of the projects that does this really well, in my opinion, or like at least has innovated quite a bit, it's having different set of requirements and permissions for different types of proposals. And like, because like all the projects are going to have whales, and it's very hard to really stop that. Like, yeah, you could get to quadratic voting and then like try to solve all the civil attacks. If you do that, okay, great, but that's a huge problem to tackle. And what they do at Cabin is that, for example, if you want to ask for less than $100, I think that's the number. It might have gone a little bit up or down, I don't know. You make your proposal in Discord, and you get a thumbs up or thumbs down in emojis from a set of people, and you're good to go. If they give you the thumbs up, then it will be sent automatically to you. And that's basically having different set of permissions for different set of proposals. And I think it makes total sense, because it's not the same asking for $100 that for asking for 100,000. And getting different set of requirements and different set of people looking at your proposal, it's really important. If you have people that are like, if you have, for example, delegates that are checking all the proposals being generated every single day, if you have a very big community, it's going to be very tiresome and very difficult for them to be doing that, because like it can get very technical at some point. So distributing that load into different set of people with different set of permissions and different set of requirements makes total sense. And I think it's something that is being growing into the community, just like slowly. And at the same time, I think right now it's a little bit locked in the tech-wise, a little bit, just a little bit. But it's something that is growing and it's evolving, and I'm pretty excited about it, actually.
Well, yeah, what are some of those challenges that things like this face, or like what are some of the reasons that it doesn't exist yet, or it can't exist in its full glory just yet? What other work needs to be done here?
I think a lot of the.
I guess.
Go for it. Yeah, it's all good.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Luuk. I guess one of the problems is defining governance itself, and that's very theoretical, but like it gets very complicated in the sense that who can do what, because at the end of the day, different proposals of different permissions for different proposals require different voting mechanisms, and about having different voting mechanisms, it's hard in the UI, it's hard in the contract, in the sense like it's doable, but like you really need to nail that down. You really need to have that granularity in the UI, and normally that's complicated in terms of UX and in terms of code. But yeah, I think it's slowly getting there, but at the moment, not many DAOs think about having different governance or different types of proposals. It's more about just having one.
Yeah, I would double click on kind of we need different types of proposals. I think there's some form of, there used to be a technical limitation here, but more recently I've seen projects like Snapshot allow you to embed different voting strategies for different types of proposals. So I'm really happy to see that. I think one limiting factor is that we should not forget that the majority of DAOs are extremely young. They started a year or 2 years ago or a couple months ago, and generally people don't know how to coordinate in such a small time frame. A lot of kind of organizations stand on years and years of rules and agreement building and kind of culture that inform kind of how decisions are made, who makes decisions, why they make decisions, and it's hard to do that in, let's say, a year's time for a DAO, especially when you're also trying to build a product or you're also trying to navigate this Web3 space, dealing with all the legal things and what so. I think just all those things together don't give us enough time to properly think about governance and organization design. And when we do, it's often at the expense of product innovation, which is somewhat necessary to stay relevant and stay alive. So I think that it's just going to take a little bit longer for us to see these real functional and mature DAOs to come forward.
I think I got nerd sniped a little bit a second ago.
Go for it.
I think for in the framing things in terms of permissions, I'll try to be disciplined in that. I think one of the challenges I see with respect to different types of proposals is who has the permission to decide what type a given proposal is. I think this is a little bit like who watches the watchers kind of stuff, but I definitely agree that different types of proposals should have different decision-making mechanisms, different scopes, different requirements, different stuff. But I kind of get stuck at who gets to decide, who has the permission to decide what type a given proposal is. I think if we leave that to the proposer, then we're in all sorts of trouble. If we leave that to a committee, that becomes quite capturable. I think probably the closest mechanism I've seen is one that is a little bit out of use right now, but it's DAOstack's old holographic consensus, where there's sort of like a two level process of first filtering what proposals get in, and then making decisions on the filtered set of proposals. I think that could be extended to some kind of like collective curation game for deciding what proposals are which types, and then voting or making some decision on each of those typed proposals in the way that those types determine. But that's a long, heavy, coordination heavy process. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts in this area? Who decides how, like, what category a proposal is, or things like that? How can that work?
So I think I have two answers to that. First, I lived over a year of my life of holographic consensus. Kind of my only job was getting paid by DAOstack DAOs, and I've seen the good and the bad side of it. I think as a filtering mechanism, it doesn't really work, to be honest. I think that the idea of having a financial stake on a proposal, it potentially raises the bar a little bit higher for people to not submit shit. But if you have to pay $30 to try to submit shit, I think it's almost a little bit comparable to what you have in DAOhaus DAOs as well, where you need to pay some tribute to get in, and you could still be an asshole even after paying that tribute. I think what we need to do is create systems, and we understand what functions in that system humans should be involved in. I think this goes back to kind of what Carlos said early on, is a lot of systems don't need human intervention or should not want human intervention. I'm a big fan of lazy consensus, kind of doing as we do, unless somebody raises their hand and say, hey, this is probably wrong, or we need to think about this. I think that in the end, a lot of this can be structured down to kind of systems design, and where the system ends, it comes down to kind of human, almost like culture. So also embedding the culture of the organization into how it operates. So at the center, systems design, kind of strict boundaries of when we make decision Y or X. And then at the edges, a lot of decisions that are not being made on chain. They could be recorded on chain if we need to kind of keep a registry of it. But I'm not really a big fan of voting on every single thing, even if it's through a Discord channel or whatever. I think sometimes you just need you need speed, and you don't need to vote on everything. But I think a registry or something that does keep track of decisions helps in kind of retrospectives and what so. But generally, I don't think something like a holographic consensus or any style of voting will be the silver bullet to solve these things that are fundamentally either a systems design question or a what decision do humans make question.
I think that's a very valid point that Luke just gave. There is not going to be a universal response for any of the questions that we make here. It's just impossible. Every single DAO has very different set of requirements. It's not the same, sushi than the DAO I created with a couple of friends. Like, it's different set of requirements, different set of people working on it. Something that, again, going back to cabins, and that I personally like is that they have 3 tracks for proposals. And the difference is the amount of treasury that you want to take from the DAO itself. And they have different set of permissions that you have, or the set of like a bigger set of things that you have. The more you ask, the higher the constraints you will have in the governance mechanisms. And that prevents you to asking for little money in the bigger proposals. And when you're asking, if you try to ask for a lot of money or a lot of the treasury for in the track of the proposals track that is very light, they have a set of I don't know what's the name they use, but it's like a set of guardians that bring down those proposals that are actually malicious. They don't have any rules over that, in the sense it's just like, if your proposal doesn't belong to this type of track or proposal creation track, you have to create in the other one. It's not like they prevent malicious or they don't like proposals, so they ban it. It's mostly only for proposals that are not in the right place. And that's the way they do it. And I think, at least for their case, it works. But yeah, as Luke mentioned, every DAO, it's a whole world. You need to find out what it works for you.
I got a little bit, but I won't hold that against him. Deacon, come on up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, really interesting talk. Sorry for jumping the gun there, but
No worries.
I'll get my hand up. So when I'm thinking about the permissions, and I was kind of tying it in with a talk we had earlier by Isaac, he was talking, a lot of times we've got the treasury stuff and the consensus stuff kind of solved pretty good. We're solving the really big problem, but there's all these other little things happening in DAOs where roles and delegation and a hierarchy of roles make more sense. And I'm talking about more of these capture angles that we think about less. In his talk, it was about notifications and how there's that monitoring service is an important thing for a DAO. But there's also so many other little things that a DAO is doing, like off-chain things like adminning Discord, or using their Google Docs, or managing the DNS, or deploying a server, or being a committee on a multisig, or all these which would be on-chain. But I'm wondering, how close are we to being able to have a little more resiliency around those things, instead of having the one guy that has the Gmail password, or a channel where we share our OnePass or whatever it is, being able to have ways for the DAO to revoke the permissions if that person disappears or gets hit by a meteor or goes rogue and starts doing evil things. And like, is that kind of the level of permissions we may see eventually, where it's just like roles in Discord? You're not going to give an individual the admin role. You create, I mean, all the power that an admin has, because that individual could disappear. You put someone in an admin role, and then that person has the access to do things. But then could a DAO actually revoke that person or assign a different person into that position of permissions? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think there's so many answers to this, but I think technically we're slowly getting there. I think something like Guild XYZ allows you to now manage a Twitter account through kind of a shared Web3 identity and what so. I think I think a more important part to it is, in the end, it's still humans doing human things. People can still go rogue and do crazy things, even if they just have a permission for one day or one whatever. Traditionally, you had legal contracts to keep people in check. They know that if they control the Twitter of DAOhaus, they shouldn't kind of post, let's say, adult content constantly, and they know that they would get in trouble, potentially legally sued if they do that. And I'm not I'm not kind of an activist for going back to traditional legal systems, but I do think that skin in the game or some form of commitment to a DAO, or kind of commitment to staying in line with what you're agreeing with, is something important. I know that Aragon early on worked a lot of Aragon Court, kind of a Web3 native way to have some sort of jurisdiction online. But I do think that this is a potential next big innovation. Either we solve that with kind of game theory and tokenomics, that you need to stake X amount to get X position or X access, or through finding ways where you could potentially be punished for malbehavior, potentially in this kind of Web3 or DAO jurisdiction that we create together. Because if you have more fallback mechanisms, you can also give more permission, because the potential downside, let's say, of a permission being granted and someone misusing that permission is that limited, or at least slightly limited, compared to full control that people have nowadays.
I would
Yeah. Just quickly, I hope that we're not like relying on the legal system to solve our blockchain problems, but I think the combination of, also from our previous talk, of reputation, maybe that more like what you were saying there at the end, of more like our own jurisdiction kind of way to solve problems. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. I won't bug you.
Yeah, I was going to add something similar to what you said. Like, I guess here the problem is trying to rely on a legacy system of Web2 that doesn't have the permissions, that doesn't work with the permissions that we are trying to set in Web3. And the solutions are being worked on. Like, if you want to have Twitter, you use Lens. With Lens, what you can do is you set up a profile with your DAO, and every single holder is allowed to create a proposal to make a tweet, or a Lens tweet or whatever, or a post, which doesn't make sense in the sense like a whole DAO voting to do that. But like, what you can do is then, if the DAO has the profile, the DAO can give permissions to a guild to publish those tweets through the DAO itself. And that way you can have like the speedness of your communication, normal communication channel through the DAO, while still having all the token holders the power over that profile. So if the communication channel tweets something that people don't like or want or goes wrong, they still have ownership over that profile. And same applies, for example, for Mirror. You can still do that with Mirror. So the problem here is trying to use Web2 technologies that don't fit with granular permissions that we are setting. And I guess the solution is them starting to use our system, as I think more or less is happening slowly, or we build new stacks, as is actually happening.
I feel like we could spend probably another hour on that general topic alone. But I think we have time for maybe one more question and discussion. So, Matt, you were raising your hand. What do you got for us?
I guess personally, for me, something that I actually like is working with bots. That brings like you at least at the end of the day, you need to trust people doing the right prompt. You cannot be at everything, even if you want to. It's impossible for you to be at every single thing that is happening in your community. So you need to trust certain people, and trusting a whole guild or someone that leads a guild, I think makes total sense. And the community decides on who is that leader. But that leader has the speed and like the knowledge to execute whatever they need. And that's something that I encourage. It happens in traditional startups, which is where I come from. You rely on teams. And this is basically the same. It's just like the permissions are more granular and can be revoked by the whole community. But at the end of the day, it's like giving permissions to someone to execute faster on certain thing without having to do explanations on every single thing, because people won't read them. That's the honest truth.
Yeah, I think this focus on enabling leadership, especially early on, I think makes a lot of sense. I think looking at, for example, DAOhaus, I mean, Stefan Deacon, Spencer Deacon, they have been here for years, and if you can recognize early on who are the diehard, hardcore DAO members and who are here potentially temporarily. So I think identifying early on who is here for a really important reason and really wants to be here, and amplifying those people to kind of shape that reality, I think is a really good way to make a lasting DAO. Because if you don't empower these voices, if you are going to fall back too much on, oh, but we're DAO, so we need to do it XYZ way. There is no specific XYZ way. It's just an exploration. And I think leaders will emerge in every community, and making sure that they are able to navigate while still having some rails in line to understand what they're doing, in case they really go against the benefit of the project. Of course, you need to be able to call them back. But generally, if you see someone having a vision, I think it's always good to let them run with it, and then reflect on how it has been built out. Because I think once you have good leadership, others will also follow, and they'll learn, and they'll kind of adapt to this leader leading the way. And from there, you'll have, for example, multiple leaders emerge. And I think this is where you have a true DAO, is when you have different visions and different leaders that can use this Web3 tool to now coordinate towards a shared, or these multiple shared visions for an organization.
All right. Well, we have hit the top of the hour, so I think we'll conclude the permissions panel here. Thank you, Luuk. Thank you, Carlos, for joining and for nerd sniping me way more than I actually let on. And thank you, everybody in the audience who was listening and provided some great questions.
Super.
Thank you guys.
Super good
thanks
talk,
guys
guys.
for keep pushing. You're an inspiration to see how much you guys care about DAOs, and I'm excited to do it for another couple of years with all of you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully we're still around in a few years.
We will be. We still have a couple decades to go, guys. We're still early on.